The small flower shop sat quietly on the corner of a busy street, its glass windows fogged slightly from the cool morning air. Inside, the fragrance of roses, lilies, and fresh greenery carried a calmness that contrasted with the hurried footsteps outside. For most customers, the shop was just another place to buy flowers. But for David, a single father in his mid-30s, it was something he had avoided for years. Flowers belonged to memories he didn't dare revisit, anniversaries that no longer existed, birthdays one celebrated as a family, and a wife who was no longer there. Yet on that morning, with his daughter's school event requiring each child to bring a small bouquet, David found himself pushing open the door. He wasn't there for romance nor nostalgia, but simply for her, for the little girl who still looked at life with wonder despite the empty space where a mother's presence should have been. The florist greeted him with a smile that caught him off guard. She wasn't glamorous in the way magazines portrayed beauty, but there was something about her presence, a warmth in her eyes, a gentleness in her movements, that seemed to fill the shop with more light than the morning sun could offer. She guided him through the rows of flowers, listening patiently as he stumbled to explain what he needed. Her hands, delicate yet confident, arranged a simple bouquet of pink roses and baby's breath, tying it with a ribbon that matched his daughter's favorite color. When she handed it to him, he felt a strange pause inside, as though the act carried more meaning than it should have. It wasn't just flowers. It was kindness, attention, and perhaps even a reminder that life still had room for beauty if one dared to look. David thanked her and left, determined not to linger on the moment. But as he walked his daughter to school later that day and saw her beam with joy while clutching the bouquet, he couldn't help but think of the florist again. Her smile lingered in his thoughts, an echo that refused to fade. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, almost unconsciously, David found reasons to pass by the flower shop again. Sometimes it was to pick up a small arrangement for his daughter's room. Other times it was simply to step inside and breathe in the scent of roses, grounding himself in something that felt alive and real. Each time, the florist welcomed him with the same gentle warmth, and each time, the quiet connection between them deepened. But connections rarely grow unnoticed. Across the street, seated in a sleek black car, another pair of eyes often watched the shop's entrance. The florist was not as free as she seemed, and the man who waited in silence was not a stranger to her. He was her fiancé, a wealthy businessman whose life was built on control, image, and ownership. And as he watched her laugh and smile with David, his heart hardened with suspicion. David didn't know it yet, but what began as a simple bouquet for his daughter had set something in motion, something fragile, beautiful, and dangerous. What felt like an innocent connection was already stirring the first whispers of conflict. And soon, the past she tried to escape and the love he never expected would collide. The weeks unfolded with a rhythm that felt almost natural. David's errands, once filled with grocery lists and school pickups, began to include small detours to the flower shop. At first, he told himself it was for his daughter, an extra bloom for her desk, a bright arrangement for her art projects. But soon it became clear that it wasn't just the flowers drawing him in. It was the way the florist looked at him without judgment, as though being a single father wasn't a flaw, but a quiet badge of strength. Their conversations remained simple. She asked about his daughter, about the kind of colors she liked. He listened when she shared stories of customers who came in desperate for last-minute bouquets, or the joy she felt when a child picked out a single daisy for a parent. Each story was ordinary, yet within those words, David found comfort he hadn't known he was missing. It wasn't romance, at least not yet. It was understanding, human connection, and a reminder that kindness could still be found in unexpected places. David's daughter adored the shop as well. She would run her fingers gently over the petals, inhaling the sweet fragrance as though each flower held a secret. The florist would bend down and show her how to care for them, teaching her which blooms needed more water and which thrived in the sunlight. For David, watching his daughter bond with someone outside their small circle was both heartwarming and unsettling. It was as if a new chapter was being written, and he wasn't sure he was ready to read the ending. But while the flower shop was a haven, the world outside its glass windows was less forgiving. Unbeknownst to David, the florist's fiancé was tightening his watch. The sleek car appeared more frequently, parked across the street at odd hours. Sometimes he entered the shop, his presence stiff and his words coldly polite, but his eyes betrayed unease. He never confronted David directly, but his silence spoke volumes. The florist tried to ignore it, burying her unease beneath her work. Yet there were moments, small, fleeting, when David caught a shadow in her expression, as if she was carrying a weight she couldn't set down. He noticed how her laughter sometimes faltered when the car was outside, or how her gaze drifted nervously toward the windows. For David, it stirred something he hadn't felt in years: protectiveness. He had built his life around shielding his daughter from harm, but now his instincts extended toward this woman who had unknowingly stepped into his heart. He didn't know her full story, but he knew enough to sense that she wasn't free. The florist's fiancé, however, was not a man who would let go easily. To him, love was not about gentleness or choice. It was about image, possession, and control, and seeing her kindness directed toward another man, even a single father buying flowers for his child, was enough to ignite a jealousy that grew sharper by the day. Still, within the flower shop, life went on. Bouquets were tied with ribbons, vases filled with water, and children smiled as they picked blooms. And in those quiet hours, David and the florist found moments of peace, fragile and fleeting, yet powerful enough to keep drawing them back. But peace built on fragile ground can only last so long. Outside, jealousy was turning into something darker, and soon the walls of the little flower shop would no longer protect them. The flower shop had become a refuge, a place where time seemed to slow and hearts could breathe freely. For David, each visit felt less like an errand and more like a step into a world he had quietly longed for. A world where someone saw him not as a man defined by loss, but as a person worthy of connection. For the florist, his presence carried a comfort she hadn't felt in years, a reminder that gentleness could exist outside the rigid expectations of her engagement. But peace has a way of drawing envy, and envy has a way of showing its face. The fiancé's silent watch soon evolved into action. At first, it was subtle, casual visits that felt more like inspections and gestures of affection. He would linger in the shop without purpose, flipping through magazines he never read, his gaze fixed more on her than on the flowers. Then came the questions: why she spent so much time with certain customers, why her smile seemed warmer with some than with others. His voice remained calm, but the undertones carried accusation. David noticed the tension, even if she tried to hide it. She moved differently when her fiancé was near, her laughter muted, her shoulders tense. The once light air of the shop grew heavy on those days, as though the flowers themselves were wilting under unseen pressure. And though she tried to reassure David with her usual kindness, he saw the truth in her eyes, the truth of someone trapped between duty and desire. It wasn't long before whispers began to spread beyond the shop's walls. The fiancé's social circle was wide, and his reputation polished. To them, the florist's small act of kindness toward a single dad were not signs of compassion, but fodder for gossip. Neighbors raised eyebrows. Customers made offhand remarks. And though no one spoke openly, the unspoken judgment hung in the air like smoke. David felt the weight of it most when he was with his daughter. He had spent years shielding her from pitying looks and careless words about their family. To now see that same scrutiny directed at the florist cut deeply. Part of him wanted to walk away, to spare them both the pain of whispers and stares. But another part, a stronger part, knew that some connections were worth the fight. The florist, too, wrestled with her heart. She had once believed security came from wealth and stability, but the longer she lived in the shadow of her fiancé's control, the more she realized how fragile that security truly was. With David, she felt something different, not riches, not status, but honesty and sincerity. Yet, leaving her fiancé was not simple. It meant unraveling years of promises, breaking ties that her family and society expected her to uphold. The storm brewing around them grew louder when the fiancé finally made his presence known to David. It wasn't through direct confrontation, but through a silent, calculated encounter. One evening, as David left the shop with his daughter, the fiancé stood by his car, his expression unreadable, his silence heavier than any words. The message was clear. He was watching, and he intended to protect what he believed was his. David didn't respond. He held his daughter's hand tighter, walked past, and kept his composure. But inside, he knew the days of quiet visits and unspoken connection were ending. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was at their doorstep. The bond between them had grown, but so had the thorns around it. Soon, choices would have to be made, choices that could break hearts or change lives forever. The weeks that followed became a careful dance between longing and fear. The florist tried to keep her days steady, arranging bouquets and greeting customers with the warmth she had always shown. Yet behind her practiced smile lay the weight of choices she had not yet made. Every petal she touched seemed to remind her of the fleeting nature of beauty, and how easily something delicate could be crushed when held too tightly. David continued to visit the shop with his daughter, though less often than before. He could sense the watchful eyes around him, the subtle disapproval in the air. He didn't want to expose the florist or his little girl to unnecessary pain. But distance, he discovered, did not weaken the bond. If anything, it revealed just how deeply he had come to value her presence in his life. The fiancé, however, grew restless. His carefully crafted world was being disturbed, and he would not allow it to crumble quietly. He began to appear more frequently, his demeanor shifting from charm to control. He no longer masked his displeasure in polite tones. Instead, his words carried sharp edges, questioning her loyalty, her choices, and even her judgment. To outsiders, he remained the picture of respectability. But within the florist world, he had become a shadow that followed her every step, reminding her the price of disobedience. One evening, as the florist locked up her shop, she found herself cornered by his questions. Questions that were not really questions at all, but accusations disguised as conversation. His voice was low, steady, but it carried a promise of consequences if she dared step outside the path he had drawn for her. In that moment, the flowers around her, symbols of life and beauty, felt like fragile witnesses to a struggle she could no longer ignore. David, unaware of the intensity of her battles, tried to keep his own life steady for the sake of his daughter. Yet he couldn't forget the silent message the fiancé had delivered during their brief encounter. It haunted him at night, the image of a man standing firm, guarding something he considered his possession. David had known challenges before, loss, grief, and the endless responsibility of single fatherhood. But this was different. This was not just about him. It was about her, about the possibility of a future together, and about the forces determined to keep them apart. The turning point came on a rainy afternoon. David entered the shop to buy flowers for his daughter's school recital, only to find the fiancé already there, his presence commanding the space. The air was thick with unspoken hostility. The florist stood behind the counter, her expression torn between fear and quiet defiance. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, the three of them caught in a triangle of tension, each aware of the stakes, none willing to break the silence. The fiancé's gaze lingered on David, his meaning unmistakable. He didn't need words. His eyes said everything. This was a warning, a boundary drawn in invisible ink, but deeply etched into the air. David felt his daughter tug at his hand, her innocence unaware of the storm surrounding them. He bought the flowers quickly, offered the florist a look that carried both concern and understanding, and left before the situation could unravel further. But as he walked into the rain with his daughter by his side, David knew that silence was no longer enough. If he truly wanted to protect what he had found with her, he would have to face the storm head-on. The unspoken battle could no longer remain hidden. Soon, choices would demand voices, and hearts would need to decide between fear and freedom. The recital day arrived, carrying with it an undercurrent of tension that seemed to seep into every corner of David's world. His daughter's excitement filled their small home, her laughter echoing against walls that had too often heard silence. For her, it was a day of music, costumes, and celebration. For David, it was something more. He knew that beneath the cheerful decorations of the school hall awaited the presence of two women who could shape the course of his life. The florist, whose kindness had touched his soul, and her fiancé, whose shadow threatened to suffocate it. The school auditorium buzzed with chatter as parents found their seats. Rows of flowers lined the stage, and to David's quiet surprise, many of them bore the signature of the florist's touch. It was as though her presence filled the room even before he spotted her. She sat near the front, hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes betraying both pride in her work and fear of the confrontation she could no longer avoid. Her fiancé sat beside her, his posture rigid, his gaze sweeping across the crowd like a warning. When the children performed, joy replaced tension, if only for a while. The little voices rose in song, and David's daughter stood at the edge of the stage clutching her bouquet. She glanced toward him often, her smile anchoring him to what truly mattered. But even as he clapped and cheered, David's eyes found their way back to the florist. Every glance they shared carried the weight of unsaid truths. After performance, families gathered in the courtyard. Children ran with ribbons in their hair. Parents exchanged congratulations, and among them, the florist approached David cautiously. Her fiancé followed, his hand resting on her shoulder as if to claim her, to remind everyone of what was his. The tension between the three of them became impossible to ignore. It was then that David's daughter, in her innocence, walked up to the florist and handed her the bouquet she had received on stage. She told her it was for the flowers she had made, the beauty she had shared with everyone that day. The gesture silenced the crowd. Eyes turned toward them, toward the small girl offering a gift to a woman who looked as though she might break under the weight of her own choices. The florist accepted the flowers with trembling hands. For the first time, she allowed herself to meet David's gaze without looking away. In that moment, she realized that love was not about possession or control, but about kindness, respect, and the courage to stand beside someone even when the world whispered against it. Her fiancé's expression hardened, the fury in his eyes evident, but the florist no longer hid in silence. The public nature of the moment made his grip on her seem small, desperate, and unbecoming. The whispers around them began to shift, not against her, but against him. The image he had crafted so carefully cracked in the light of truth. David stood quietly, not as a challenger, but as a man willing to wait, to let her decide her own path. His daughter's innocent gesture had done what neither of them could. It had exposed the heart of the matter in front of everyone. The florist clutched the bouquet to her chest. Her choice reflected not in words, but in the simple act of stepping slightly away from the man who claimed her and closer to the man who had never asked her for anything but honesty. The moment marked an end and a beginning all at once. The fiancé's power waned. The whispers grew into murmurs of disapproval, and the florist, though still uncertain of the road ahead, knew that love built on kindness was worth the risk of stepping into the unknown. Love had found its voice, not in grand declarations, but in flowers, in innocence, and in the quiet courage to choose what was real. If you enjoyed the story, rate out of 10 in the comments, and don't forget to like the video.